Bruce Clarke is Paul Whitfield Horn Distinguished Professor of Literature and Science in the Department of English at Texas Tech University and a Baruch S. Blumberg / NASA Chair in Astrobiology at the U.S. Library of Congress. His research focuses on systems theory, narrative theory, and Gaia theory. And did you know Lovelock pretty well?
I met him once.
Personally, or?
I met him in 2020.
He passed away, what, like a week and a half ago? Yeah.
Rest in peace.
On his 103rd
In
birthday.
cybernetic formation.
Yeah. All right. Okay, I'll keep reading here. His latest book is Gaian Systems, Lynn Margulis, Neocybernetics and the End of the Anthropocene. Minnesota Press, 2020. Other books include Neocybernetics and Narrative, Minnesota 2014, Posthuman Metamorphosis, Narrative and Systems, Fordham University Press, 2008, and co-edited with Manuela Rossini, The Cambridge Companion to Literature and the Posthuman, Cambridge 2017. His edition of Writing Gaia, the scientific correspondence of James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, co-edited by Sébastien Dutreuil. Claire?
Dutreuil?
Oh,
Yeah, right there.
Wait, I don't have the
Yeah.
glasses.
Well,
D-U-T-R-O-U-X.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dutreuil.
Okay. Yeah. Will be released by Cambridge University Press in the fall 2022. I butchered the last title, so if you want to correct me, Bruce, I'll give you the floor, okay?
That's terrific, thanks. Hi, everybody. These two books were just mentioned. These are the books in which I take a stab at bringing laws of form together with narrative theory. The talk today reaches back into some of this material and adds in some more recent thinking, and in an attempt to make a very fast kind of summary take on what I've tried to do in this area. So I'm just gonna lay it on you as fast as I can and try to slip it in within my time constraints. Okay, so Reentry in the Laws of Narrative Form and Eternal Sunshine. So it's mainly going to be the technical matters of how to work the form, laws of form against narrative theory, and then for some lighter relief, we'll turn to Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind to take a look at how some of this might work out. Hopefully, most of you are familiar with this movie because I have no time to play any clips. All right, so this talk selects, condenses, and refines some of my efforts in previous papers and publications to redescribe major concepts of narrative theory through Spencer Brown's calculus of indications. Restated through laws of form, these narrative distinctions are produced when the text's own significations call and cross the formal boundaries constituted by the discourse at hand. Narrative discourses frame their forms of observation by placing, maintaining, or shifting cognitive borders. In other words, by marking a textual sequence of narrative distinctions. A given narrative discourse will proceed through one or more narrative situations that depend on the location of the narrator or narrating instance, either within or without the marked spaces that demarcate the story world, and on the possibility of supplemental narrative levels superseding the original diegesis or given story world. All the while, distinctions among the temporal relations of narrated events determine the order of the discourse from which the story being told is then rendered as a completed sequence when the narrative is said and done. So concepts of relation drawn from laws of form, I argue, enable critical attention to keep even more precise accounts of these essential narrative affairs. So this talk will focus in particular on the concept of reentry, the self-referential embedding of a form of distinction back into its own indicational space, and will suggest ways to discern at least 4 distinct modes of reentry. So to begin with, chapter 11 of Laws of Form presents what I will call formal reentry as a mode of recursion that embeds a form of distinction back into its own marked state. And to this, Niklas Luhmann's operational deployment of formal reentry adds a mode of what I will call systemic reentry, the reentry of the system environment distinction back into the system. A cognitive move specific in Luhmann's scheme to the autopoiesis of psychic and social systems, that is, to observing systems of distinct kinds. I will then examine how both the formal and systemic modes of reentry provide templates for observing the narrative techniques I will be calling discursive reentry in the literary medium and diegetic reentry in the cinematic medium. So here is a very compressed version of my laws of narrative form. So in narrative theory, the technical name for the story world and its events is the diegesis. In any medium, it is brought into virtual existence, however, by the discourse, that is, by the signified utterances of one or more narrators, or in the cinematic medium, narrating apparatuses. The diegesis or story world may be considered a multiply marked state with the narrative agencies conducting the marking. As founded on the analysis of literary fiction, narrative theory's next key move distinguishes the actual author from the fictive narrator and takes the utterance of that narrator, its discourse, as its basic term. That is, basically the author is bracketed out of this form of narrative theory. So the primary indication of the narrator per se now ramifies into a distinction between 2 kinds of narrator. The first person or character-bound narrator I abbreviate as the CBN, and the third person or authorial narrator, which I abbreviate as the AN. In character-bound or first-person narration, the discursive agency is re-entered into the space of the diegesis. That is, the character-bound narrator exists within the frame of the story world itself. Character-bound narrators are virtual observing systems immersed within but operationally distinct from their narrative environments. In contrast, while realistic character-bound narrators are contained within the frame constructed by their own perceptual enclosures, by the operational closure of observing systems, the authorial or third-person narrator stands outside the story world of its characters. So if we condense, that is, by these by Spencer Brown's logic here, if we condense the story world with the characters that occupy and move within it, we can observe how the authorial narrative attitude is poised to cancel the forms that cut the character's world out of the unmarked space. This relatively unbounded narrator can recross the frames of the character's story world. For instance, a strictly authorial narrator observes a character's outer and inner life from somewhere beyond the story world, describing both actions and feelings, and this would be a typical authorial narrative statement about a character. He rushed around, worried, sick about being late for his Zoom call. So an authorial narrator can cycle through the diegesis it produces, moving across the boundaries constituted by the characters themselves, observing them from both sides, not all at once, but in successive moments as the narration unfolds. Now, for another mode of formal reentry in narrative form, consider what's called free indirect discourse, also sometimes called figural narration, as distinct from authorial narration proper, which we were just talking about. Free indirect discourse in narrative arises when the form of the authorial narrative situation is re-entered back into the authorial situation itself. So in free indirect discourse, the ostensible authorial narrator renders itself covert, and that's what the brackets indicate in my diagram. The authorial narrator renders itself covert by reaching inside the character's mind, not just to observe its dynamics, but also to ventriloquize the character's distinct manner of expressing the same situation. So the same, and this is how a free indirect version of the same statement would go. Basically, you hear the character's voice, even though it's still spoken by the narrator. How in the world was he going to be ready in time for his Zoom call? Hear the difference? So the diagram of reentry as a potentially infinite expression in laws of form rhymes in particular now with these further narrative structures I'll briefly discuss. It rhymes in particular with the narrative structure of metadiegesis, which is in Genette's system, the technical name given to what's also called frame narration or embedded narration, or just simply stories within stories. A potentially infinite embedding of distinctions among narrative levels. Metadiegesis brings about one or more separate distinct diegeses beyond the original diegetic instance. For instance, in our diagram here, narrator A tells a story about character B, but then character B introduces another story about character C, who then also proceeds to narrate yet another story, and so on, potentially ad infinitum, to create the dreaded mise en abîme, which is essentially a form of infinite metadiegesis. In most cases, however, when additional narrating instances and hence further narrative levels emerge beyond the story worlds already being narrated, the discourse diegesis distinction, excuse me, is reconstituted, preserving basic ontological propriety in the telling of the story, that is, it maintaining the separation of the world of the telling, the narrator and its discourse, from the world of the tale, the story world where the characters are. Nonetheless, metadiegesis, stories within stories, subtly unsettle realistic decorum or ontological propriety, because the open-endedness of frame narrations makes it possible for a kind of positive feedback to break out within the narrative process, in which recursions of further metadiegetic narrations can spin ever further away from the initial narrating instance of the discourse. John Barth has a famous long short story called The Menelaad, where he embeds the tale to seven levels, and then pops, and then in the end we pop back out to the original levels. That's a famous example of that technique. And finally, the narrative vice term metalepsis, which we'll see a lot of in Eternal Sunshine, is built on a related but distinct mode of formal reentry in the narrative discourse. The difference here is that the device of metalepsis purposely transgresses the boundaries of realistic narrative structures by undercutting the presumed separation between the universe of the narrator's discourse and the universe of the diegesis. Unlike the specter of a mise en abîme, however, the recursive dynamic in metalepsis does not produce a logical regression, but rather an alogical inversion, bringing out an interference, overlap, or reversal between the locations of the diegesis and the discourse, rendering their distinction indeterminate. So the recursive process in metalepsis induces an oscillation, or what Heinz von Förster might call a flip-flop effect. The classic literary case study of metalepsis is Julio Cortázar's two-page story of 1964 titled The Continuity of Parks. And if you look at our diagram here, very quickly in this story, an authorial narrator A describes a character B holding a book and reading a story about the murder of a character C in that embedded story, but then the victim, character C, turns out to be the reader B. And so that's the flip-flop or the inversion of level B coming back upon level C in a magical, or at least unaccountable way. Okay, so the imaginary here embedded story about a murder enters the real universe of the primary diegesis. And so cinematic works, my short list would be Being John Malkovich, Mulholland Drive, Inception. Cinema has because these effects kind of work really well when they're condensed, and cinema is excellent for that kind of narrative compression. So you see a lot of metalepsis in postmodern cinema. For instance, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. In this movie, the form of cinematic narration is repeatedly re-entered into its own diegetic space. So you'll recall how, if you know the movie, you'll recall how in separate visits to the Lacuna Clinic, unhappy lovers Clementine Krasinski and Joel Barish submit their entire memories of each other, bad and good, to be wiped out once and for all, or so the clinic claims to do. As the discourse of this fantastic romance unfolds, the cinematic apparatus will cut across the multiple boundaries of the story world, including the waking mind of Joel Barish, confronting its conscious experiences and decisions, and the inner memory world to which he gains increasing access, the more he unconsciously resists the erasures to which he had thought he wanted to submit himself. So Eternal Sunshine, the movie, pushes the multiple re-entries of its multiple narrative levels toward a series of metalepses, leading to spectacular moments when the narration induces the separate diegeses of Joel's inner and outer worlds to crash into each other. With the movie's opening frames, and then for several minor episodes, Joel comes forward as both a character and a voiceover narrator synchronized with his conscious states and waking actions. That is, his voiceover commentaries are simultaneous with the film's nonverbal narration of his external activities within the waking story world. This is where it starts. Everything seems kind of normal until it goes metaleptic. Initially, these two levels of the cinematic situation shift back and forth in a normal sort of way between external observations by the camera and character-centered thoughts and perceptions rendered by the voiceover narration. A single boundary forms between these two levels, a border between the cinematic narration of the external story world within which Joel is a character and the internal voiceover narration or cinematic soliloquy running in Joel's head. But then a few minutes in, the cinematic text folds over the temporal order of its discourse with an external retroversion that is a foundational flashback to the real world events of the evening before the opening scene of Awakening. Crossing its own initial temporal boundary, then, the text effectively cancels its initial time frame. The form of this external cross then begins to reverberate within Joel's mind, as he is now presented as having been the night before in a drug-induced stupor, which he's forgotten about when he wakes up the next morning, having his brain invaded by the Lacuna technology and specific memories sequentially wiped out by the Lacuna procedure. So these outer events occurring in Joel's apartment of the guys running the procedure on him, that's the currently present environment within this story world, begin to cross into the realized dream and memory events of his unconscious mind, the internal diegesis I'm going to be calling Joel's memory world. So let's call this technique diegetic reentry, in which the boundary between the external cinematic observer and the observed character has been re-entered into the narrative structure itself. In this instance, the re-entry occurs as a diegetic expansion within the mind of the character narrator created by the cinematic narration. While remaining character bound, Joel's observations and voiceover narration begin to shift to an extra diegetic situation that is more like an authorial narrator, although he's not narrating, but to an extra diegetic situation relative to his memory world and to a position of increasing temporal distance from the diegetic locations of the memories embedded within his increasingly lucid dream of those memories. So when he is voiceover narrating the events of his memory world, Joel is in his external present relative to their internal past. Now, consider as emblematic the way one particular scene of diegetic interference between his drug-induced dream state and the lacuna-provoked memory world interspersed within it embeds a literal image of metalepsis. And this is it on the screen. As you see, within the encompass...
I'm just going to give you a couple minute warning if we want to leave 5 minutes for Q&A in just a couple minutes.
Okay, I'm racing along, so let me keep at it and then throw me another warning if I'm going over. So what we're looking at here is within the encompassing cinematic screen is a TV screen within it whose separate image is sutured directly to its embedding frame. Specifically within the presentation of a memory of Clementine that is set in his apartment and currently occupying the full cinematic frame, the picture on the TV screen merges almost seamlessly into the picture on the big screen of the room containing the TV set. But other moments of cinematic metalepsis and internal sunshine induce diegetic interferences rather than, as we see here, a moment of merger or suture, such that the form of the distinction between his outer environment and his internal psychic system is re-entered into his psychic system. In other words, once Joel is under the lacuna procedure, a third narrative level emerges as a second boundary develops inside his mind, the boundary between his inner awareness of being presently under the procedure and his increasingly interactive witness of the past memories that the procedure is currently mapping in order to delete. So the initial temporal loop from the morning after to the evening before the procedure took place in the diegetic world external to the character. But subsequently, all further flashbacks concurrent with and reaching backward from Joel's ongoing lacuna procedure are staged internally within the memory world of Joel's dream state. So the cinematic discourse cross-cuts the narration of the procedure with the narration of the events leading up to his decision to have the procedure done, which these are the memories that are being recovered. From there, we were taken along as Joel follows the procedure's retrospective itinerary, working backward from the painful incidents of the recent breakup to earlier, sunnier times.
Hey Bruce, do you want to open it now? Do you want to open it up to Q&A or in just a minute?
Okay, sorry, I had 2 more paragraphs, but that's fine. There you go.
Well, if you want to summarize real quick, just because we gotta stay on schedule. It's real tough this afternoon.
Yeah, sure. Here's my last paragraph. I'll blast it out at you. So in conclusion, ever since the first oral or epic poet told a story that embedded another storytelling character inside its own story, the modes of narrative reentry have been hiding in plain sight. And if we now venture to generalize radically about narrative cognition from the example of the extreme possibilities bound up with metadiegesis and metalepsis, it turns out that no matter which way one turns, there is no way out of the logical bind, that there is no final frame or last level at which to halt either the positive or the negative play of embedding, either as regression or as oscillation. Any narrative is virtually abyssal, that is bottomless, lacking ultimate foundation. Each level relies upon some other further inner or outer frame to prop it up internally or externally, which circumstance necessarily applies as well to that further frame. And a storyteller can choose to exploit the opportunities provided by these built-in narrative deficiencies or slippages, and a reader can choose in response whether or not to question if this essential lack in narrative being also recurs as an actual facet in the extra-narrative world. I take it that laws of form, manifesting the emergence of worlds from the void of the unmarked state, also implies this inescapable incursion of the imaginary into the real. Okay, there you go. Thanks.
Thank you
for your patience. I did my best to impress.
It's so cool to have all these different modalities of thinking laws of form. So why don't we meditate on this for like just a couple minutes of Q&A, and we'll dwell in the narrative mode. I bet Leon is in there. Yeah, there's but we have a queue of questions in the chat.
It's more of a discussion.
More of a discussion. In it. It's a self-contained sort of thing. Okay, someone go ahead. Raised hand.
All right, me.
Yeah.
I'd like this trick of merging narrative levels is indeed quite common. I'd like to recommend Stanislaw Lem in his Siberian. There was a Tales of the Trill Told to King Genius, I think is the name is.
Yeah, that's
one of the tales within the tales within the tales.
Oh, yeah.
Is an evil vizier managing to assassinate his king by plugging the king into this dream cabinet, in particular the one called the Labyrinth of Sweet Infinity, which is a dream which consists of the king plugging into the cabinet for a dream called the Labyrinth of Sweet Infinity, and so on indefinitely. So,
yeah, no, that's wonderful. I just mentioned real quick, I've got a discussion of the Siberiad in my book, Posthuman Metamorphosis, taking up the wonderful way that Lem just has all kinds of fun with metaleptic hijinks.
One of them I find really inspiring in a way was the one where Churro gives the king what is in essence a box-sized video game containing a whole kingdom for him to torment. Churro goes home triumphant. His friend Cleopatra says, "What have you done?" And which brings us right to the question of subjectivity. Are those real people or not? You see, and the problem is that Churro, to satisfy the deposed tyrant, had to make the thing as realistic as possible. And but in the end, they rushed back to see what to be done. They found but they got there too late, because by the time they got there, the people, other inhabitants of the fictitious virtual kingdom had found a way to actually physically break out of the box and destroy the tyrant king. So this is also a level breaking thing.
Absolutely.
Can I break in there?
The reality within the video game box proved to be real enough to destroy the user.
Yeah. We're gonna take a coffee break in a moment, and I just want to. Okay, I have a question. Well, or comment, or a way of siphoning this as well. I think about dramaturgy as a sort of application, but like living dramaturgy, right? Like we're doing it right now. I mean, I guess I'm performing now, but you're performing, and we all have these little boxes, and so anyway, we talk about these like creations, these like poetic and literary creations, these narratives that we create, drawings, even mathematics, but it all comes down to this. This is if we want to be about laws of form and those like primary operations and stuff. This is where it's happening, right? This is life. This is like. Anyway, all right. Okay, real
comment.
quick, Lou. Less than 1 minute. Okay.
One last comment.
Okay.
I want to recommend to you a narrative you might not have encountered. It's a book by Raymond Smullyan called To Mock a Mockingbird, in which he creates a society of individuals called birds who interact by describing what the others do, and when two birds interact, they become yet another kind of bird, so that the society is entirely reflexive, and the narrative that he makes about his society of birds would be well analyzed by your methods.
All right.
Thanks, I've got that. I'm just gonna there's my email address if anyone cares to pick up the conversation, since we're out of time here. I'd love to hear from you, so thanks very much.
Great.
Everyone.